So at this time, if we are ready to go with Dr. Anton Treuer, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Ahauchi miigwech. Koedash indinwe magani dog niwi ojibuem ajanes mietagod winda munugu gawian Waagosh indigu Miinwaa migizi and dodem gazagasquaji mekag and dunjiba Miinwaa niminwendam apaji hiji wabin diang Miinwaa wewene wien wazu young diminonisodota diang. I'm just really excited to see you all today and see many of my Anishinaabe colleagues and friends. I've had the opportunity to come out to Walpole a few times. Also, Aloha Nailima, the ambassador of Aloha, honored to have you with us, and very honored to have met you a couple of times at our Anishinaabe language events and have your voice in the conversation today. I'm going to queue up this PowerPoint. In my Ojibwe introduction, just adding that my Anishinaabe name is Waagosh, meaning fox. I come from the Eagle clan. It's hard to see since we're on Zoom, but I'm sporting my Eagle bling today. And come from Leech Lake, which is one of the Ojibwe communities in northern Minnesota. Very happy to be here today to address what's going on with our language and what we can do to strengthen, stabilize, and revitalize our language and culture in all of the many ways that we use that. This is a testy time. I think in politics, in race relations, in many different fronts. And I think a lot of people are aware that we're at a time when there's a real bottleneck with climate change. We're having fewer and fewer animals and birds on the planet, and this can destabilize our ecosystem. But some people are less well aware that we have the same thing happening with bodies of human knowledge and ways of knowing, as many indigenous languages are very endangered, and it is ultimately incumbent upon us to do something to keep these things alive. In one of my recent books, The Cultural Toolbox, I was sharing about the connection between our language and our culture and how this affects our identity as Anishinaabe. I've always been of the view that it's not so much the case that we have souls, it's more like we are souls and we have bodies for a little while. We're not humans looking for a spiritual experience. We're spirits and we're having a temporary human experience. But as we have been dealing with historical and contemporary traumas and the process of colonization, I think a lot of us feel disconnected from some of the most important things about us. And it's important just to remind everyone that you are a complete, fully realized human being, a soul who has a body. You are the one your ancestors were praying for and waiting for through the generations. You have been given a unique set of gifts, and you yourself are a gift to the world. This is one of my elders who passed away a little over 10 years ago. Her name was Betsy Schultz, and I was especially close with her father, Archie Mose. Archie was a really interesting man. He was born in 1901. He had a very long life, and when he was born in a wigwam, and even all of his children were born in wigwams. He received the name Archie as a preteen, and he was in his mid-30s the first time he ever saw a car. When I met him, he was watching WWF SmackDown on a TV in a modern house, laughing really loud. And I've always thought about the changes that he's seen in his lifetime. I ended up learning a lot from him about our language and our culture. And it was strange to me, but he, even in his 90s, Archie was someone that everyone relied upon for so many things that what was strange was not the reliance on him, but that he seemed to work so hard with so few breaks. Like he would do almost all of the speaking at the ceremonial big drum and even a lot of the singing in his 90s. And I remember thinking, why don't some of these young people help him out? You know, he just knew so much, and he had so much quan that ultimately they just wanted his voice. And he passed away in 1996, and I'd been working with him for quite a while and was quite close with him. And I remember driving over to the drum ceremony, you know, a year after his passing. This was in 1997 now, and wondering who's going to be speaking, who's going to be doing the prayer, who will speak for. We have a custom there where people would bring a bowl of food and tobacco if they wanted to add special requests for healing and life. And I remember driving over there and thinking, I have no idea who they're going to have talk. He just dead it all. And his daughter, Betsy, had been close to me and really loved my relationship with her dad. And she would see me and kiss me on both cheeks and hug me close, and was always so kind to me. But she also, you know, had this good kind of like mean Indian look, her dark glasses. And when she stared at someone, usually it was her grandkids, and she'd hold up her cane and they would go do whatever she said right away. And she never really looked at me that way until I showed up at that drum ceremony. And she came up to me. She had a pouch of tobacco in her hand. And she said, "You want to know who's talking today?" I said, "Yeah, I'm really kind of curious." And she said, "You are." And she handed me that tobacco. And I remember my chin kind of hitting the floor and just couldn't imagine that I would be thought of to do something like that. And she had a line of people behind her. There were 13 of them, and each one had tobacco and a bowl of food, and they were setting them up at the ceremony. And she said, "You're talking for all of them too." My dad never forgot someone's native name, and he never forgot what they were asking for when it was time to pray. I'm going to be listening. And she just sat back and gave me that look that she often gave her grandkids. And I remember being so terrified as I stood up to give the invocation and to talk for the bowls. And I dared one glance at her when we were done. And she just gave me one slow nod. And then she shook her cane at her grandkids to go eat out of the feast bowls. And after that, there's kind of been no escaping from the tobacco and the use of our language in ceremony and other places, even though I consider myself to be a very unlikely candidate to know much of anything at all about our language or our ways. An unlikely candidate for a few reasons. One is, these are some pictures of my father who's not native at all. He was born across the ocean in Vienna, Austria, and he was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a Holocaust survivor. He spoke only German the first 13 years of his life. He and his parents and two cousins got out of there. Everyone else was killed in the Holocaust. He made his way to the United States, had many kind of restarts in his life. At age 17, lied about his age, enlisted in the US Army. He wanted to go kill Nazis, and they sent him to the Pacific Theater. He was stationed in the Philippines. Eventually, he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mom grew up in a little village, 400 people in the heart of the Leech Lake Reservation. Half of those people are my cousins. And my relatives there have been buried in the same place longer than America has been a country. But because of this, you know, having a biracial family, and my father who spoke German and English well, but did not speak Ojibwe, it is pretty unlikely that I would be someone who would know much about our language. This is a picture of my great-grandmother, Isabel Matthews, and her generation was the last generation in my family where our tribal language was the language that was used for everything from disciplining the children, doing the chores. It wasn't just a language used for ceremony or special occasion or when adults did not want to be understood by the kids, but it was how they ran the house. And there was a change in our family as my grandmother, Luella, who passed away about 7 months ago at the age of 98. She had a pretty long run. And she, as a small child, was sent to residential boarding schools. and forbidden to speak our tribal language. And although she had this gift, she thought it would be a cause for the persecution of her own children, and that it might be a favor to them not to share everything that she had received. And so this broke the intergenerational transmission of language in our family. And my mother grew up speaking English, even though her mother and her grandmother, who she was very close with, would speak Ojibwe. These are some pictures of my mother through different chapters of her life. And as she was going to school, I think some parts of our culture were everyday things that everybody did: hunting, fishing, gathering wild rice. They pulled all the kids from school because all the kids had to be involved in food production. But as she went to school, she only met one professional Native person ever. And that person was the school nurse. So she thought, maybe I can do that. And she went on and got a nursing degree. From there, she came back to work for our tribe and thought, I don't like the way Native people are getting pushed around, and I'm going to do something about that. And she went on and got a law degree. And she ended up becoming the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. So I grew up watching my mom with a suit and powwow braids, going to court, being the only woman in court, and being the only Native person in court, and fighting with effect. And I think that helped instill in me the belief that I could do what I would set my mind to doing. But at the same time, the experiences of both of my parents, kind of amazing and challenging each in their own ways, still didn't equip me to be someone who'd know much of anything about our language and culture. We experienced some poverty when my folks were getting started. My father was restarting his life. My mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. And we used to have this little house that had no running water. We had a hand pump. We had an outhouse. Didn't matter how cold it was. We had, this is me as a kid, we'd wash up in the creek in the summer, enamel wash basins in the winter. I never felt poor, never had food insecurity. But I was in about middle school when my mother got her law degree and built a nice house, and it revealed the power of an education. And that is something that I've always valued in my life. But I probably traumatized my own parents in my own way as I finished college and told them, I am not going to take a job and I'm not going to graduate school. I'm coming home and my plan is to learn about our language and culture. And they said, well, that sounds wonderful. Good luck paying for it because we're done. And so I ended up driving, and this is Archie Mose, who I was mentioning a little while ago, over to see Archie Mose. And this is before cell phones. So I just drove over there and was looking up Mose's in the phone book. He's from another res right on the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, and eventually connected with him. And when I came into his house and he's watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing, I remember expecting him to be sitting there, smoking a pipe and praying for world peace or something. But he shut off that TV and he looked at me and he said, oh, I've been waiting for you. And I remember thinking, well, how could you be waiting for me? You don't even know who I am. But he had a dream. And I looked like the young man that he saw in his dream. And because of this and his faith in what he dreamed, he just flung the door wide open for me. I ended up moving in with him. I'd sleep on his couch. He had such a tiny house. And then I was his gopher. Go for this, go for that, drive him here, drive him there, haul in his drum, haul in his pipe. And I started to learn a lot about our language and our culture. He could speak a little English, but not very well. I remember driving him to the bank, and he had a little pension check because he used to drive truck for the Polk County Highway Department. And he could not endorse his check. He couldn't sign it. He had never finished second grade, but I still consider him one of the best educated people I've ever met. We brought him, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but we brought him to the Conference on World Religions in Chicago. And the Dalai Lama was here, and there's a picture of him with the Dalai Lama. And it's kind of interesting, but they look like they could be related. Brown, glasses. And the Dalai Lama wanted to meet Archie because he was the oldest spiritual leader who was there. And as they came up to meet him, there was a big line of monks and they started bowing. And Archie had never seen anyone bow before and he didn't know what to do. So he started patting everybody on the head saying, that's okay, it's all right. And the Dalai Lama stopped everybody because in the Buddhist tradition, the head is sacred and it was taboo to touch the head. So he said, how do you greet? And Archie said, I don't know, shake hand. And so the Dalai Lama goes like this and Archie says, no, like this. So they got an arm wrestler handshake. And I always kind of appreciated that little cross-cultural exchange. Niba Giizhik, Evening Sky, that was Archie Mose. That started me on a path. And unlike a lot of our formal schooling environments, I kind of had a more holistic immersion in our language and culture, but I did a lot of other things going after our language too. I took classes, I pestered my elders, I recorded everything that I could, I worked on transcriptions. Eventually that segued into a career as I did eventually go to grad school and used our language to explore history and do publications in Ojibwe and things like that. I was busy with other things too. This is a picture of my family. It's a great big blended family, 9 kids. It's never dull. And as this journey began, I had to think about something else critical about our language, which is, it's one thing for me, like when I was spending all my time with Archie, all I really wanted to do was be in the room. I was curious, I wanted to learn and I wanted to be with him. But it's kind of like Forrest Gump when he figured out how to run. After that, every time he went somewhere, he was running and he never thought it would take him anywhere. And that's how I felt with the language. I just wanted to be learning. I never thought it would take me anywhere, but of course it did. And I came to realize too that our culture, our language, it's not just a thing outside of us that we hope for and we wish for and we sometimes quest after. It's actually something that lives inside of us, that we carry in our bones, in our DNA, in our blood, but also in our minds and in our hearts. And in many ways, we look at our body as a cup, the temporary housing for our soul, and other things go in the cup too. Our native names, our clan, our language. And when we fill up our cup with good things, it pushes out the bad things and it heals us and stabilizes our understanding of who we are. So this is another important message for everyone, is that the connection and culture live inside of us. And having a rich cultural life and a rich language life is not just about looking out and looking for, it's about looking within. And we can do that wherever we live. And the healing and the awakening is healing and empowering. In a place like Walpole, the last time I was there, they had identified 17 remaining fluent first speakers of Anishinaabemowin. And connecting with them and centering them in everything that is done is so vital and important and worthwhile. But for everyone else, through no fault of our own, here we are, and we are right where we should be, having been through all the things that we have been through. No one is less than if we didn't receive all of this on a silver platter. But our cultural patrimony and language still lives inside of us. We just have to wake it up. And as my family got started, I had to think about, would it be possible to restore the intergenerational transmission of our language in my own family? And my firstborn daughter, Giizhik Kwe, is, when she came into the world, that was my life. Like, my goal was to speak nothing but Ojibwe to her, to give her everything that I could. And I remember, as a 2-year-old, as she would wake up in the middle of the night and say, Dogushke nanu sen gishka bagwe dudu shabu niwi minikwen. And I just remember her crying around for milk in the middle of the night and thinking, it's working, it's working. And I had this glimmer of hope with the whole effort. And it has been so healing and heartening for me to see her own trajectory as she has shouldered our language and our culture too, and got to grow up doing some of the things that even my mother was sometimes denied. One time I was giving a speech, and this is probably 20 years ago, at Anishinaabemowin in Sault Ste. Marie. And she was running in circles around me, literally around me in the podium while I'm trying to give a talk. And finally her voice caught on the microphone and she said, "Hingi Booget, I farted." And after that, the whole place erupted into laughter and no one could hear or even care about anything else I wanted to say during that speech. But that little kid became famous. "Did you hear that kid? She was itty bitty. She was speaking Ojibwe. That was awesome." And again, I was thinking of what I could give to her and hadn't really thought about how that might equip her to give something to everybody else. Today, she's part of our language team. She's sitting here working with one of our elders, recording and transcribing stories, and she's publishing books and doing things with the language too. And it is so heartening to see that she is interested in that, and also that her ability to do it has been happening not just by her personal questing, although she's been doing that, but by something that has been shifting and changing in our family and in our community. We are working to restore the intergenerational transmission of our language and culture. So I've been asked to share a little bit about one of my other recent books called The Language Warrior's Manifesto: How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds. And I won't go through everything. Of course, there's no time to go through everything there is in a book, but among the things I share in there is a little bit about why this is important. And there are so many reasons why. But it's important that we think about that, because there's a temptation, if we don't, to think that the language is neat or pretty or another pretty bird singing in the forest. And of course, we'd love to hear all of the pretty birds, but that doesn't necessarily center it as critically important. And if we ourselves don't see and live its importance, then we will never be successful communicating that to the rest of the world or making it happen, living the language. Of course, there are obstacles, and I'll spend less time on those because they're probably more obvious to most of you. I also share a little story about our family journey, as I've done just now, but with more detail. And there's a collective one about what we are undertaking in the Ojibwe universe to scale this up and deliver it through immersion schools and programs, new tools and resources. And there are some truly exciting things that I want to share with you today to help you understand that, including, as of March 1st, the publication of year 1 of Rosetta Stone for our language, numerous new books and tools, new nonprofits and immersion schools. And there is some really exciting stuff to share with you. So I want to take you on a abbreviated version of this journey, hoping that it will help pollinate the garden that you're trying to grow out at Walpole Island. And I'm really glad to see that Nailima's in this conversation and part of your events too, because the Hawaiians, of course, are great heroes to us in their work with Indigenous language revitalization. And they and the Maori, who kind of pioneered this effort in the world, are some of the indigenous groups that have been seeing some success. And although they'll be the first to say it is ongoing work and it's still hard work, we need to see what's actually working so that we can try to replicate and scale those things up in our communities and space. So the first thing to mention is that language revitalization work is courageous work and it is hard work. In fact, all that's necessary for a language to die is for us to do nothing. A lot of people don't realize this, but the best indicator of the language that a child will speak is not the language of the parents, nor is it the language of the teacher. It is actually the language of their peers. And this is why when immigrants come into a new language community, they will speak the heritage language at home with their children, but the children will usually go to an English medium school and will learn English well. They'll use their heritage language at home and English at school and with their friends. And then as they grow up, they're more likely to marry someone else who speaks only English. Even if they don't, they're more likely to use English at home, and their children will have an English experience at school, in society, and at home. And it only takes 2 generations to break down the use of a heritage language in a family. And this is where the immersion schools end up being so significant, is because they have more success than a lot of other ways for getting the peer language to be our heritage language. Apologies for that, a little bit of a nose going today. And the other thing to say, and this is how I feel about Anishinaabemowin, is that the future vitality of Anishinaabemowin is not certain, but it is certainly possible. And it really depends on the depth and breadth of our interventions to keep it alive right now. And I've seen a lot of things that give me cause for hope. We have other barriers. A lot of our people are focused on prestige and profits. By the way, I'm not letting myself off the hook. There's a thing, whiteness, and frankly, I can be pretty good at it. And sometimes when we go out into the mainstream world and we're navigating that, we get more rewarded the better we are at that. The better my academic English, the better I'll do. The more I massage white racial comfort, the better I'll do. And we do this code switching thing. We go out into the world, and when we're looking for who's in charge, we're often, dealing with a, school administrator, teacher, police officer, banker, or whatever, and they're someone not from our racial group. And so we code switch to meet them where they're at. And sometimes when we do a lot of code switching, there's this transition where the code switching becomes assimilation, where the indigenous parts of ourselves become invisible, sometimes even to ourselves. And we are seeing these macroeconomic trends. There are 6,700 languages spoken in the world. 2,500 are extremely endangered. And, ultimately there are only 100 languages that are widely taught at colleges and universities. And they're even worried about a language like Swedish, which has, 10 million plus speakers, and it's an official language for a country because everyone in Sweden also speaks English, and they're getting more of their publications and media in English, and they're just worried about where that takes them in the long run. In this area of Canada, where we, people at Walpole will often even import fluent speakers from this region because there are more of them to work in language programs. And it's just easier to find people from places like Bkejwanong or Sagmuk. And there are a lot more speakers there. But even in those places, Bkejwanong, which has been a long time bastion of our language, only a little over 20% of the families report using the tribal language as the everyday language in their home. And so we're seeing language shift there. And of course, as you spread out from there, the fluency rates drop more. Also, we start segregating people by age. We put the little kids with the little kids and the elders with the elders, and the intergenerational communication and transmission of our language and culture gets interrupted that way by our systems. The best way for someone to learn a language is to learn it as their first language at home. But if we say it has to start at home, it'll never start, simply because in a place like Walpole, most of the children are not being raised by the few remaining fluent speakers. And so we have to do second best, which is to engineer in some ways what might seem like artificial environments in immersion school or things like that in order to really make it happen. Of course, there's resistance on the outside, proliferation of, a handful of world languages at the expense of many others, official English and French, and not official Indigenous languages. I do think you have some ballast in Canada coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation effort, because there is new funding being appropriated for Indigenous language revitalization as part of a restorative justice practice. So that's heartening to see. If you want to teach someone how to read in English, you have 5,000 books loaded in an accelerated reader program. The teacher can put a computer in front of the kid, say, read the book, take the test, and it's pretty easy to start engineering that. But if you're working with an endangered language, when I started working with Ojibwe, you could count the number of books on a couple of hands. Of course, there are hundreds of them now. We've been doing a lot of work, but that's still not 5,000 books that in an accelerated reader program to make literacy successful. And we need those things. A kindergarten child, a 5-year-old, will start working on letters. I can identify the letter A, A, A first grader is working on sight words, and, the, and so forth. Some of the second graders are already reading chapter books. I had a second grader who was reading Harry Potter, So the explosion into literacy happens quickly if we don't have the tools to assist that transition into literacy. Apologies for the tech interruption and any stress that might have caused anybody. But, there are all kinds of things. A lot of people are just unaware of the issues, even inside of our communities. I've been really privileged to know a number of people from the Seminole Nation in Florida, and they're really fascinating. They're one of the most financially successful tribes in all of the United States, and they completely eliminated poverty for their enrolled tribal citizenry. But if you talk to our brothers and sisters at the Seminole Nation and you ask them, what keeps you up at night? They will say language and culture loss. And I have the sense that a lot of our leaders are working so hard and with such good integrity, trying to climb this mountain of economic prosperity, tribal sovereignty, and these things matter. But I'm concerned that they'll get to the top of the mountain and look around and say, oh no, we just climbed the wrong mountain. We should have been climbing the mountain of language and culture revitalization. Because that's something that defines us as a people and really gives us our sovereignty. If we're assimilated with everyone else on the planet or everyone else in this country, why would we need to have separate governments? It is our language and culture that defines us and gives us our own way of thinking and solving problems. In order to think about how we can be effective, though, we can't just say, here's what matters and everybody come meet us over here. We have to meet our people where they're at. A lot of our people have been struggling with the basics: food, clothing, shelter. And that takes so much of our time and attention. And we should be understanding about that. It's a complex world that we live in and navigate. And at a place like Walpole, I think half of the enrolled tribal citizenry lives off res, And so we have to find a way to build the bridge and connect with them too, not exclude them from the effort. And so we have to meet people where they're at, not just compel them to be where we want them to be, or we will both be ineffective and frustrate ourselves and be unfair with our own people. There's a really great book that is not specifically about language revitalization, but has a lot of relevancy for us. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I kind of felt, honestly, like I needed a bottle of aspirin and a thesaurus to get through that. It was super academic. But there's some really beautiful and thoughtful stuff in there. And among them, he talks about oppression and says, if you take an oppressed group, and for the sake of irony, we'll use the Pilgrims, right? If the Pilgrims are being oppressed in England and they get into boats and they go all the way across the ocean and they get away from the people who are oppressing them, was that the end of oppression? No. Where was it? And the answer is they carried it inside of themselves. And it showed up in their community in 4 ways. So the first was internalized oppression. And so that would be blame and shame stuff in the Puritan culture. For us today, this shows up as a higher suicide rate, substance abuse, negative self-talk. I'm dumb. I'll never get it. I could never learn my language. I'm not good at languages. It also shows up in the form of lateral oppression. That's people being mean to their own people. So for the Puritans, that's like Salem witch trials would be a good example. For us, it's the crabs in the bucket stuff. Who does that guy think he is? Probably has a beaded pen in his beaded briefcase, thinks he's better than everybody, that kind of talk. And then the third way is intra-oppressed group oppression, where you might have anti-Black talk show up from Indigenous people, or homophobia, or any number of other isms. And only one of these 4 pillars that hold up oppression is coming from an outside group keeping us down, the Canadian government running residential boarding schools. 3 of the 4 pillars happen inside of our communities. That means that we can control 3 of the 4 things. Because frankly, all those things, the internalized oppression, intra-oppressed group oppression, lateral oppression, they all hold up white supremacy, English language dominance, and things like that. But if 3 out of 4 are happening in our space, we can actually exert a lot of influence on those things. We should also fight for justice with number 4, but we shouldn't spend all of our energy there. So that means talking well to ourselves, saying, I love me. I love all the parts about me, my complex racial identity, my history, my experience. I love my relatives. I think my ancestors did the best that they could. And here we are, the recipient of all their gifts. We actually have a language we can fight for. We shouldn't be down on ourselves or our fellow people. We shouldn't be blaming elders for what they didn't teach or blaming young people for what they didn't learn. We should be supporting and holding each other up and saying, I'm so glad that you're all here interested in this right now. And as we do so, I think we can find a lot of, and I'm back. Sorry about that. Zoom has given us a little trouble today, but here we go again. Yeah, so, in the Hawaiian tradition, the head is a sacred space and one of the sources of spiritual fire. The belly button, Piko, another source of spiritual fire. The genitals, also representing future generations. And we need to tend all of these sources of fire. A well-tended fire can grow strong. A neglected one can grow weak. It's really interesting, but the ancient Hawaiian custom, when a baby was born, was to take the stub of the umbilical cord that falls off, a week or so after a child's born, and carve a divot in the lava and put the stub of the belly button there. And then remember the spots and put the next one and the next one. And when a girl would grow up and become a mother, putting a circle around her spot and then her children going there. And when you go out to the, to the petroglyphs, you can see, kind of acres and acres of divots and circles, connecting people in their case to their matrilineal line and to the Aina, to the Mother Earth. And I think that this way of thinking about the gifts that we inherit with our language and culture has application in our Anishinaabe space too. We speak about the whole body as a vessel that holds our soul. It's very similar to the Hawaiian thinking about the head as a sacred vessel. And some of the things that are really impressive, a little over 30 years ago, the Hawaiian language was illegal for use in public schools. Today, it's one of the official languages for the state of Hawaii. When they were getting started, there were maybe 1,000 speakers of Hawaiian left. And I believe there are around 24,000 speakers now. Some 3,000 or so have learned it as a first language in the home. So something's happening there. And among the things that they'll do, we speak in an Anishinaabe context about the 7 grandfather teachings. And the Hawaiians have their own set of teachings and values. Aloha, meaning hello, goodbye, and I love you. Also, ohana, family. And they have a whole list of them. And you can see these things working in the schools as they will line up the entire staff outside of the school in rows waiting to receive the kids who come. And the kids have to line up facing the staff and sing in the Polynesian tradition, which is what these kids are doing here, asking for permission to come in the school. And the staff sings back, and every single kid gets a hug from everybody who works there every single day. Aloha. And I think, in the mainstream educational system, we would think, are you serious? 45 minutes on cultural enrichment to start every school day? Our kids are awake in the morning. Make them do math. Until you realize that, Navajo, for example, has a 100% graduation rate, and they don't have a really significant truancy problem. So speaking to people in their cultural language has profound academic effects. And it's not like we're going to appropriate the Hawaiian way of doing things in an Ojibwe, Ottawa or a Potawatomi context or something like that. But we can see the value of speaking to people in their cultural language. What would it look like for us to do this our way in this space? And there's a lot that we can think about there. This is Rose Tainter. She's one of our esteemed elders who passed away several years ago now. And she was saying, we want an Ojibwe immersion school like those Hawaiians had. And she got one. In fact, the flagship Ojibwe immersion school, Waagosh, was created 23 years ago now. And I'm very privileged to sit on the school board for that organization and to work with the language warriors at Waagosh. It's in the Hayward Lakes region on the Lakudere Reservation in Wisconsin. And we've been working really hard. It is an ongoing effort, but we're seeing some remarkable results going on there. I'm happy to share more, although there's a lot of literature about what they do in the immersion schools. But just to give you an indication, I was doing some observations there. This is a while ago now, 8 years ago, and they'd built a 4-year-old early childhood program. And I was watching as a 4-year-old kid was running circle time. And this 4-year-old kid gets up there and says, hey kids, what's going on with the weather today? And they had a little felt board set up behind him. And one of the other kids says, Anizagate, Kadebwe. So he puts up a little symbol for the sun peeking out behind the clouds. They put another one up for a strong wind. And for the rest of circle time, 30 to 40 minutes, there was a 4-year-old kid running class and fully interactive with all of the other kids. And I was thinking, man, I can't even get my kids to sit still for supper. The classroom management was pretty amazing, but the language skills were too. It wasn't like those kids had 20 years in the program and then finally started to get it. They were 4 years old. They'd been in there for 6 or 7 months. And they were operating in a language that their parents didn't speak at home. So that model can do some amazing things. And there's a lot more to the technicalities of how to do an immersion pedagogical approach, not just call it immersion and ask our best speakers to throw a few words at the kids. They'll end up using English a lot, and you'll get a language enrichment experience instead of a fully immersive language environment. There's a difference between the two. And so I think it's important that we think about what we want, hold ourselves accountable to those standards, and then start to make it happen. As we exercise our sovereignty, that's what that means. I think something else I learned, from the Hawaiians is that no one person can do it all. And we all have something that we can contribute. So some people there just said, we're just going to deal with the politics. And they fought to remove the legislation that would prohibit the use of their tribal language in the school. Then they fought to get Hawaiian recognized as an official language. And some people just fought that fight. Others said, I'm going to work with the youngest kids and just worked on the language nest. And some said, I'm going to work on curriculum. Others said, I'm going to do lexical expansion so we have vocabulary for new technologies and things like that. And as each kind of picked lanes and accelerated into them, it enabled the work to proliferate. All of those battles matter. I don't think it's like either or. Should we spend our efforts making new books or an audio system or an immersion school? I think we should do all of those things and a whole bunch of other things too. And we need to support and hold one another up, as all of the efforts really matter. And we all have something to teach, and we all have something to learn. This is a white guy who is an ally to us, and we used him as the face to advocate for bilingual signage in our area. And he would just go knock on all of the businesses. And in our area now, we have, most of the regional businesses, the public schools, the hospital, even the cop cars have Ojibwe language signage. I think I've got an image. Yeah, here's the cop cars. Giizhik Miinwaa to protect and serve. Now that stuff, it's not because we have so many monolingual speakers who need to see that to know what is going on. What it does is it makes our language visible. And it says this stuff matters. And our language is normal, not weird, exotic, or only for ceremony, but for everything in life. And so I think that message has been helpful and well received. If you're interested in a little more what's going on with some of the Anishinaabemowin revitalization efforts, there's a good documentary called First Speakers, Restoring the Ojibwe Language, that profiles some of the immersion schools, the community of Panema, where there's a high fluent speaking population, and some of the resource production efforts that are underway. That's available for free at tpt.org. It's also up on Vimeo and YouTube. So any of those venues, you can find it for free. First Speakers. And by the way, I'll make sure that Charlene gets a copy of my PowerPoint and can share that with you. So if there's anything referred to in here, you'll have access to it. This is some of our Jedi Council. In Mille Lacs, they did a language survey, and this was just maybe a year before the pandemic, and identified 25 fluent first speakers left in that particular community. So it's actually quite comparable to Walpole Island. And they brought me to a meeting, and I'm from the next res over at Leech Lake. And at the meeting, they said, look, we have some money left over from grants, and we want to make sure that we do something responsible for our language with the overages from these grants. And we wanted to pick your brain. We've identified 25 fluent speakers, and we're not sure which areas we should work in. I said, well, how much is the overage from your grants? And they said, well, it's about $14 million. So I just about spit my teeth out. That was an awful lot of money. And I gave them a list of stuff that I thought we needed to do. And they looked at that and they said, well, let's do all of it. It was one of the best meetings of my life. It was amazing. We have had heartbreaks and setbacks, as about 20% of our remaining fluent speakers in that community passed away during the pandemic. And we've had some amazing accomplishments. These elders, I said, instead of asking them to work their butts off and teach the kids all day, every day, let's do some things that will set them up to teach people for hundreds of years to come. And we ended up developing a series of literacy initiatives and new kids books, 5 books. We had to actually teach the elders how to do Zoom. We sent someone in their COVID bubble, one of their grandkids, over to their house with a computer. I remember catching Carol Nickerboin and I was like, Buju asin, gedano kimen, Giizhik Kwe, Nendmowin. So we got to do some work on the language. He goes, oh, I forgot. I got my coat on. I was going to go to the casino. Well, the language is more important. Okay, let's work. And she sat down. We started working on the Zoom for a couple hours. She got done and she goes, well, I'm going to the casino now. My niece has been waiting in the car the whole time. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, it's crazy, but drop anything for the language was kind of the attitude. And to see what they were able to produce. Joe Naakmoigeng, and he's the elder on the far, your far left with the big turtle emblem on his shirt. During the pandemic, his brother and his sister passed away, both fluent speakers. And when we had the book launch event, which we did just some months ago, I thought he would be saying, this is the hardest time of my life. And you know what he did? He got up there and he said, working on these books and working on these other projects, we had about 50 people working full-time on this. I think it was the best time of my life. And I just couldn't believe that I would hear that from him. He was so heartened to see our young people leaning in, to see the support of his tribe, and to see his fellow elders from his generation working so hard. It was really inspiring. We also worked and continue to work in the development of Rosetta Stone. This has been published on and available to the public as of March 1st. The name of the program at Mille Lacs is Anishinaabemowin, means changing lives. And Rosetta Stone, what's cool about that is that it pushes to an app on your smartphone. It can find a person who wants to access our language anywhere they are on planet Earth. It has integrated content that includes video, audio, text, talking flashcards. It'll correct your pronunciation as you interact with the app and your grammar. The teacher guide alone for year 1 of Rosetta Stone is 500 pages. The main Rosetta Stone unit has 12 units, each have 12 to 20 lessons. So it's pretty comprehensive. That's year 1 of Rosetta Stone. We'll be producing year 2 and releasing it next year, and then year 3, 4, 5, and 6. And we orchestrated the contract so that we prepaid for all of it, and all of the elders are paid directly by Rosetta Stone. The tribe retains the copyright and the intellectual and cultural property rights, and they collect any revenues. So there isn't a non-native corporation that controls our language or access to it. It's a tribal entity that does that. Also, we anticipate they charge nothing for tribal members. Their tribal members, $25 for tribal members from any other native nation, and it's $100 for anybody else. Even with those pretty reasonable financial requests, they anticipate recuperating all of the cost for the production of Rosetta Stone, so that in the long run, this will have cost the tribe nothing. How cool is that? Now, Ojibwe is not one language. It is a collection of interrelated language dialects, and the differences are significant. But the other thing that Mille Lacs has said is that if there's any other Ojibwe dialect that wants to do Rosetta Stone, we will show you our mechanics, our process, how we did our contracts, how we worked with our team. And of course, you would need to cut new video and audio that is appropriate for your dialect. But a lot of the legwork will be freely available to any other tribe that wants to work on it. So I think what this does is it provides powerful tools for a particular dialect of Ojibwe, and the related dialects around it will probably just use that. But there may be other dialects, maybe a place like Walpole Island that wants to get going on this, and scale it up in your space too. The work is so transformative. I like the Carl Jung quote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are transformed." I have found this to be my experience, that when we do language revitalization work, it of course transforms the young people who are learning about our language and culture, but it also transforms our elders who are empowered, emboldened, and healed in the process of creating such tools and resources. This is a view off the front deck of my house. I kind of feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. But among things that had happened when my folks were getting started is my folks had acquired a piece of property for relatively little money, but it looked like this, wide open farm fields. And that's my dad on the tractor with my brother, started planting trees. And it completely transformed the entire landscape and ecosystem. He planted all of the trees in this picture here. And to me, it's empowering to see this every day, because I think when we think about race relations, climate change, how to keep our language alive, we are tempted to think, look at this mountain of problems. How am I ever going to overcome that? And we feel despondent. But it's not like we need to move that whole mountain right this second. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can transform the entire landscape and ecosystem. Every time we teach a child, every time we build a new school, every time we build a new program, every time we build a new learning resource, that's what we're doing. Every time we have a conversation like the one you're having today, it's truly powerful and important work. This is one of my elder mentors, Anna Gibbs. When my last child was born, we were really worried about her because she came into the world a little jaundiced, slow to nurse. She was having some health problems. And Wasabik said, she's going to be fine. And I know she's going to be fine because I already had the dream about her native name. And you go put out some tobacco. You make sure you give her her first bath with the medicine that was given to our people. And don't let them do medical experiments on her placenta. That goes next to a maple tree. The maple tree is the tree of life. And that's where that goes. And it'll give her a long life. So we did all of these things. Eventually, that kid woke up and she's pretty healthy, bossy. You should see her. The name she got was Giizhik Kwe, Big Boss Eagle Woman. And she really grew into that name because she's one of the most strong-spirited little kids you could ever imagine. And today here's what she looks like today, Spear and Fish. She's 10 years old, bright, and kind of dauntless. It's amazing to see what's happened with that kid. Just last week, I took my family out into the sugar bush, and it's so cool, but my oldest daughter did the prayer in our tribal language to open up the sugar bush. One of my sons told the legend that explains where we got the gift of food from the trees. And then my kids went out and put tobacco offerings by all of the maple trees, the trees where their placentas are buried, to then take life from the trees of life where their own placentas are buried. And there was this feeling of like kind of holistic connection around our culture and our language and the restoration of its transmission across generations. All the stuff we've been dealing with, residential boarding schools and everything else, the historical and contemporary traumas, we can heal from that. And the key to the healing is our language and our culture. And I'm just so heartened to see all of you embracing that. So with that, I just want to say miigwech, thank you for your kind time and attention. I really appreciate you and for your patience with a couple of Zoom interruptions. Just really excited to see everything that you are taking on out at Walpole. I'll drop the PowerPoint. Miigwech.